consequences to that, and that was the sort of thing that Nietzsche was concentrating on. And he actually in some ways made it worse, because Nietzsche was an incredible critic of Christianity. I mean, he wrote a book called The Antichrist, and all he did in that book brilliantly was take dogmatic Christianity to task. Now, one of the things he did say, which is very interesting, was that Christianity died at its own hand. So his notion was that because Christianity, say Judeo-Christianity, had elevated truth to the highest virtue, that search for truth then ended up undermining the axioms of Christianity itself. So it developed a tool, an unbelievably powerful analytic tool, and then used it to, well, it's like we were sitting on a branch and sawed it off with the saw that we had invented, and then everyone fell. And Dostoevsky, well, Dostoevsky was an Orthodox Christian, but also an extraordinarily brilliant man, and he was absolutely terrified at what the consequences of the dissolution of that belief system was going to mean for Russia in particular. And Dostoevsky explored nihilism to great degree in Notes from Underground and in Crime and Punishment, because the murderer in Crime and Punishment is essentially nihilistic. He's a nihilistic narcissist, roughly speaking, and that's what compels him to commit murder. But Dostoevsky also wrote a book called The Devils, which is an amazing book, where he predicted that the sudden death of Christianity in Russia was going to produce the catastrophic totalitarian horrors of the Soviet Union. And he predicted that in like 1880, 1890, which was 30 years before the revolution. Absolutely remarkable. Nietzsche, a genius. Nietzsche was a full professor when that was impossible, I think when he was 24. And that just never happened. And so his extraordinary genius was recognized very early. But he was also extraordinarily ill, sick, physically. His dad died at about 40 of something they called softening of the brain, which was actually a fairly common diagnostic category back then. No one really knows what it was. Some people have suggested that he had syphilis from one sexual encounter, or that it was hereditary, but nobody really knows. But anyways, his father died young, and Nietzsche died very young as well. He was mentally incapacitated for the last few years of his life, and died after that. And so he could only serve as a professor for a while because he couldn't see very well, and he was always sick. And he ended up living in this little village, I believe in Switzerland, where he wrote his books, and he could only write a paragraph or two at a time before he became very ill. And so his writing is extraordinarily condensed and dense and brilliant. And I think he gave away, Beyond Good and Evil, which is his masterpiece, although he had many, I think it only sold 500 copies in his lifetime. So he also believed that he was only writing for himself. He didn't really know if anybody was ever going to pay any attention to what he said, but they certainly did. So I would say he ended up being certainly one of the 10 most influential people of the late 19th and early 20th century. This is an example of his writing. Of what is great, one must either be silent or speak with greatness. With greatness, that means cynically, and with innocence. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently. The advent of nihilism. Our whole European culture is moving for some time now with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as towards a catastrophe, restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that's afraid to reflect. He that speaks here has conversely done nothing so far but to reflect, as a philosopher and solitary by instinct, who has found his advantage in standing aside, outside. Why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Sorry about that. Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals. Because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value those values really had. We require at some time new values. Nihilism stands at the door, whence comes this uncanniest of all guests. Point of departure. This is a good example of how Nietzsche said he philosophized with a hammer. And it means that he spent hours, days, weeks, months concentrating on how to make a single sentence as packed with significance as he could possibly manage. And so Nietzsche said, it's the best arrogant statement I've ever read. He said, I can say in a sentence what it takes other people a whole book to say. And then he said, what they can't say in a whole book. That's pretty good, eh? It's like, the first one's a real blow to the solar plexus, and the second one is like, I can top that with no problem. Point of departure: it is an error to consider social distress or physiological degeneration or the corruption of all things as the cause of nihilism. That's a critique of the later Freudian ideas right there and then, because what Nietzsche says was, look, if things are going wrong for you, or if they're going wrong in general, it's really straightforward to say that, well, there's something wrong with society, that would be social distress, or there's some physiological degeneration, there's something wrong with you physically, or everything is just corrupted, being itself is corrupt, which is a classic explanation, right? You hear that all the time. You think, well, people are suffering for one reason or another. Well, why? Well, there's something wrong biologically, or society is corrupted and everything is unfair. Nietzsche says, no, you're not going to get away with that. First he says, ours is the most honest and compassionate age, comparing modern civilization, let's say, to everything that has come before it. So speaking of corruption is not something you can do lightly. And then he says, and this is remarkable, distress, whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not at all produce nihilism. That is the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. Well, that's a rough one. It's like, well, you had a rough childhood. Well, someone else who had your childhood might not have drawn those conclusions. So here's an example. You know that most people who abused children were abused by as children, right? But most people who were abused as children do not grow up to abuse children. And you can figure that out arithmetically, because if it was the case that everyone abused grew up to abuse, in about 4 generations everyone would be being beat to death in childhood as a matter of course, because it would spread exponentially. That isn't what happens. It dampens. And why is that? Well, if you're bullied as a child, we could say, well, you could draw 2 conclusions, causal conclusions. Being bullied caused me to be a bully. Fair enough, man, that's an understandable story. How about being bullied caused me not ever to be a bully? Well, why is that any less reasonable a conclusion? It's frequently one that people draw, and since the 2 opposite conclusions can be drawn from the same set of experiences, you cannot say that the experiences caused the conclusions. And that's Nietzsche's critique of, say, sociological or psychological determinism with regards to the optimism or pessimism of your worldview. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. Right. Rather, it is in one particular interpretation, the Christian moral one, that nihilism is rooted. The end of Christianity, at the hands of its own morality, that was the development of the sense of truth, which cannot be replaced, which turns against the Christian God. The sense of truthfulness, highly developed by Christianity, is nauseated by the falseness and mendaciousness of all Christian interpretations of the world and of history. A remarkable claim. And then this one's even worse. It's absolutely brilliant, I think. Rebound from God is truth to the fanatical faith, all is false. That's nihilism, an act of Buddhism. And Nietzsche explains that. And this is, you know, I talked to you guys a little bit about the idea of the game and the metagame, you know, the metagame being the set of all games. Nietzsche draws on a conception like that for this criticism, because he says when you lose faith in something, and that happens to people very frequently, when you lose faith in something, because you're human and because you can abstract, it's not only that you lose faith in that thing, that person, that system. The fact that you've lost faith in that indicates to you that it's possible to lose faith in anything, in every system, in every person. Once burnt, forever shy. And that's nihilism. The fact that one thing can collapse on you can make you completely unwilling to manifest any faith in anything whatsoever. And that's the emergence of nihilism. The end of the moral interpretation of the world, which no longer has any sanction after it has tried to escape into beyond, leads to nihilism. Another critique of Christianity embedded in that sentence, he said, well, Christianity needed to be destroyed even by itself because it put so much emphasis on the afterworld, on heaven, that it forgot completely about life now and here, and because of that needed to be destroyed, because life here is sufficiently rife with suffering, so it needs to be addressed. And people, it's wrong, it's incorrect to inform people that they should wait for some hereafter and justify their suffering in that manner. And so he would say in some sense that even the idea of compassion, which is central to Christianity, is also one of the reasons why Christianity collapsed under its own weight. The untenability of one interpretation of the world upon which a tremendous amount of energy has been lavished awakens the suspicion that all interpretations of the world are false. Well, so what? You might say, well, so what if you don't believe in anything? Well, I would take a neuropsychological approach to that. Most of the positive emotions, dopaminergic. It's a consequence of the manifestation of the exploratory system that has its roots in the hypothalamus, a very ancient part of the brain. It's the same part of the brain that cocaine and heroin, all the drugs that people like to abuse, the drugs that are exciting, not the drugs that are calming, it activates that system. It's the system that's activated when something exciting happens to you or when something novel happens to you. But more importantly, it's the system that's activated when you're pursuing a goal and you see that you're moving towards the goal. So what does that mean? No goal, no positive emotion. So you say, well, if you have nothing to believe in, if you have no value structure left, because a value structure says this is better than this, no value structure, no positive emotion. Well, and so what's the problem with that? It's easy to get rid of your positive emotion. That's not a problem because it's rather fragile and tenuous. Try getting rid of your negative emotion. Good luck. That is not going to happen. So what happens is that if your value system collapses, then all you're left with is negative emotion. And that is not a good thing. Well, so Nietzsche would say, well, why do people flee into the arms of totalitarians from the specter of nihilism? It's because totalitarian certainty, even though it involves slavery and the sacrifice of reason and intellect, totalitarian certainty might be preferable to nihilistic chaos. Well, it's a big problem. And he said, well, I'm telling the story of the next 200 years. It's like, well, ever since then, for the entire 20th century, we bounced between nihilism and totalitarianism with deaths on both sides, constant, and we're still doing exactly the same thing. Dostoevsky was a big influence on Nietzsche, and it's very interesting to read them in parallel because Dostoevsky is of course a dramatist and Nietzsche is a philosopher, and it's almost as if Dostoevsky wrote the drama and Nietzsche provided the philosophical commentary. They're very, very powerful to read together. This is from Notes from Underground. It's a very short book about this character who is a bureaucrat, nasty sort of bureaucrat. He knows he's a nasty sort of bureaucrat. All he does, he spends his whole life trying to make life more miserable for people because he's so resentful and crushed and weak. And so he just did nothing but abuse his bureaucratic position and used his trivial bit of power to lord it over people. He gets a little bit of an inheritance and quits. And this is his confession, Notes from Underground. He's the underground man. It's a brilliant book. It's viciously funny, and it's so psychologically alive. If you're interested in psychology, it's a spectacular book, and it's only about 100 pages long. Anyways, he's arrogant and nihilistic and resentful, and what he does is he tries to justify his life to himself and does a very poor job of it, even though he's trying to be honest. There's a lot of honesty in it. At one point, he meets a woman who's been forced out onto the streets because there weren't very many options for women in the Victorian period who had fallen afoul of economic necessity, and he basically, in a fit of false messianism, offers to save her, which he can't because he's completely useless. He can't save himself even, but he offers to save her, and she more or less accepts. And then when she shows up, having sacrificed a tremendous amount to do so, he basically tells her that he was toying with her and joking and makes her situation far worse than it was to begin with. It's a brilliant book. Because you see, he repents. He says what he's like. He's this horrible person. He knows it. weak and resentful, and then he confesses, and then he says, well, now I've confessed, I'm a better person. Then he tries to do something good, but he hasn't changed a bloody bit, not a bit. The confession was just to make himself feel better. And so he offers to help someone and pulls them right right under the water where they drown. It's an amazing book. And this is from Notes from Underground. In short, one may say anything about the history of the world, anything that might enter the most disordered imagination. The only thing one can't say is that it's rational. The very word sticks in one's throat. This is a good example of the existential criticism of the idea of rationality. Dostoevsky says, well, lots of things operate according to rational principles. But let's think about history for a minute, especially from the perspective of a thinking and feeling being. History is a slaughterhouse. It's a catastrophe. And how would you ever consider that something rational? Dostoevsky's point is rationality fails in its analysis of something as complex and terrible as history. The only thing one can't say is that it's rational. The very word sticks in one's throat. In short, and indeed, this is the odd thing that is continually happening. There are continually turning up in life moral and rational persons, sages and lovers of humanity who make it their object to live all their lives as morally and rationally as possible. So to be, so to speak, a light to their neighbors, simply in order to show them that it is possible to live morally and rationally in this world. And yet we all know that those very people sooner or later have been false to themselves, playing some queer trick, often a most unseemly one. Now I ask you, what can be expected of man since he is a being endowed with such strange qualities? This is a criticism of utopianism. That's what he's trying to do, right? Because the utopian ideas were starting to emerge in Russia at about this point in the 1880s. The idea that you could reorganize society so that material privation would disappear, and that as a consequence, the paradise would be ushered in. Well, Dostoevsky was no fool. He knew perfectly well, A, that was never going to happen, but even more importantly, that if you gave people exactly what they wanted, even what they needed, there's no reason whatsoever to presume that would make them any more sane than they already are. Now, and he takes that further because he says, well, you can give people cake and material goods until they're satiated, and they'll still be ungrateful and insane. And you might think, well, that's pessimistic. But then he says, well, wait a minute. What makes you think that insanity isn't exactly what's valuable about people? What makes you think you would ever want to take that away? And that's the case that he makes. Shower upon him every earthly blessing. Drown him in a sea of happiness so that nothing but bubbles of bliss can be seen on the surface. Give him economic prosperity, such that he should have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of his species. And even then, out of sheer ingratitude, man would play you some nasty trick. He would even risk his cakes and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive good sense his fatal, fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly, that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were so necessary, that men are still men, and not the keys of a piano, which the laws of nature threaten to control, so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by the calendar. And that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even if this was proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposely do something perverse out of simple ingratitude, simply to gain his point. And if he does not find means, he will contrive destruction and chaos, will contrive suffering of all sorts, just to gain his point. He will launch a curse upon the world, and as man is the only animal that can curse. It's his privilege, the primary distinction between him and other animals. Maybe by his curse alone he will attain his object. That is, to convince himself that he's a man and not a piano key. And if you say that all of this too can be calculated and tabulated, chaos and darkness and curses, so that the mere possibility of calculating it all beforehand would stop it all, and reason would reassert itself, then man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and gain his point. I believe in it. I answer for it. For the whole work of man really seems to consist in nothing but proving to himself every minute that he's a man and not a piano key. It might be at the cost of his skin. It might be by cannibalism. And this being so, can one help being tempted to rejoice that it has not yet come off, and that desire still depends on something we don't know? You will scream at me, that is, if you condescend to do so, that no one is touching my free will, that all they're concerned with is that my will should of itself, of its own free will, coincide with my own normal interests, with the laws of nature and arithmetic. Good heavens, gentlemen, what sort of free will is left when we come to tabulation and arithmetic, when it will all be a matter of twice 2 makes 4. Twice 2 makes 4 without my will, as if free will meant that. It's brilliant, I think. It's one of the most remarkable criticisms of utopianism I've ever read. It's like, and it's so intelligent. It's like, what makes you think that if you had everything you asked for, that would satisfy you? What if being dissatisfied is part of what satisfies you? What if the fact that you have to have limits and need them, and that there's an element of insanity in the world, and that there's an element of insecurity and vulnerability? What if that's what you need? What if it's what you want? What if that's what gives your life meaning? You're going to be like a lion after it's eaten a zebra and do nothing but sleep. It hardly constitutes the appropriate human paradise. What makes people think that merely providing economic security would be sufficient? Who wants that? It's what you offer a cow in its pen so that it remains calm and fat. It's not something for human beings. And that's Nietzsche's fundamental point. And he formulated that, 40 years before the damn Soviet Revolution, when that sort of utopianism was put into practice with absolutely catastrophic consequences. Kierkegaard. It is now about 4 years ago that I got the notion of wanting to try my luck as an author. I remember it quite clearly. It was on a Sunday. Yeah, that's it, a Sunday afternoon. I was seated as usual out of doors at the cafe in the Fredericksburg Garden. I had been a student for half a score of years. Although never lazy, all my activity nevertheless was like a glittering inactivity, a kind of occupation for which I still have a great partiality, and for which perhaps I even have a little genius. I read much, spending the remainder of the day idling and thinking, or thinking and idling, but that was all it came to. So I sat there and smoked my cigar until I lapsed into thought. Among other thoughts, I remember these. You are going on, I said to myself, to become an old man without being anything, and without really undertaking to do anything. On the other hand, wherever you look about you in literature and in life, you see the celebrated names and figures, the precious and much heralded men who are coming into prominence and are much talked about, the many benefactors of the age, who know how to benefit mankind by making life easier and easier. Some by railways, some by omnibuses and steamboats, others by the telegraph, others by easily apprehended compendiums and short recitals of everything worth knowing. And finally, the true benefactors of the age who make spiritual existence in virtue of thought easier and easier, yet more and more significant. And what are you doing? Here my soliloquy was interrupted because my cigarette was smoked out and a new one had to be lit. So I smoked again, and then suddenly this thought flashed through my mind. You must do something. But inasmuch as with your limited capacities, it will be impossible to make anything easier than it has already become, you must, with the same humanitarian enthusiasm as the others, undertake to make something harder. This notion pleased me immensely, and at the same time it flattered me to think that I, like the rest of them, would be loved and esteemed by the whole community. For when all combine in every way to make everything easier, there remains only one possible danger, namely, that the ease becomes so great that it becomes altogether too great. Then there's only one want left, though it is not yet a felt want, when people will want difficulty. Out of love for mankind and out of despair at my embarrassing situation, seeing that I had accomplished nothing and was unable to make anything easier than it had already been made, and moved by a genuine interest in those who make everything easy, I conceived it as my task to create difficulties everywhere. Kierkegaard again. There's a view of life which conceives that where the crowd is, there's also the truth. And that in truth itself there is need of having the crowd on its side. There's another view of life which conceives that wherever there is a crowd, there is immediately untruth. So that, to consider for a moment the extreme example, even if every individual, each for himself, in private, were to be in possession of the truth, yet in the case they were all to get together in a crowd to which any sort of decisive significance is attributed, a voting, noisy, audible crowd, untruth would at once be in evidence. For a crowd is the untruth. In a godly sense, it is true eternally, Christianly, as St. Paul says, that only one attains the goal, which is not meant in a comparative sense, because a comparison takes others into account. It means that every man can be that one, God helping him therein, but only one attains the goal. And again, this means that every man should be careful about having to do with the others, and essentially should talk only with God and with himself, for only one attains the goal. And again, this means that man, or to be a man, is akin to deity. In a worldly and temporal sense, it will be said by the man of bustle, sociability, and amicableness, how unreasonable that only one attains the goal. For it is far more likely that many, by the strength of united effort, should attain the goal. And when we are many, success is more certain, and it is easier for each man severally. True enough. It is far more likely. And it is true also with respect to all earthly and material goods. If it is allowed to have its way, this becomes the only true point of view, and it does away with God and eternity and with man's kinship with deity. It does away with it, or it transforms it into a fable, and puts in its place the modern, or we might rather say the old pagan notion that to be a man is to belong to a race endowed with reason, to belong to it as a specimen, so that the race or species is higher than the individual, which is to say that there are no individuals but only specimens. But eternity, which arches over and high above the temporal, tranquil as the starry vault at night, and God in heaven, who in the bliss of that sublime tranquility holds in survey, without the least sense of dizziness at such a height, those countless multitudes of men, and knows each single individual by name. He, the great examiner, says that only one attains the goal. Nietzsche, a similar comment. The traveler. A traveler who had seen many countries and peoples and several continents was asked what human traits he had found everywhere. And he answered, men are inclined to laziness. Some will feel, he might have said with greater justice, they're all timid. They hide behind customs and opinions. At bottom, every human being knows very well that he is in this world just once as something unique, and that no accident, however strange, will throw together a second time into a unity such a curious and diffuse plurality. He knows it, but he hides it like a bad conscience. Why? From fear of his neighbor, who insists on convention and veils himself with it. But what is it that compels the individual human being to fear his neighbor, to think and act herd fashion, and not to be glad of himself? A sense of shame, perhaps, in a few rare cases. In the vast majority, it is the desire for comfort, inertia, in short, that inclination to laziness of which the traveler spoke. He is right. Men are even lazier than they are timid. And what they fear most is the troubles with which any unconditional honesty and nudity would burden them. Only artists hate this slovenly life and borrowed manners and loosely fitting opinions, and unveil the secret, everyone's bad conscience, the principle that every human being is a unique wonder. They dare to show us the human being as he is, down to the last muscle, himself and himself alone. Even more, that in this rigorous consistency of his uniqueness, he is beautiful and worth contemplating, as novel and incredible as every work of nature, and by no means dull. When a great thinker despises men, it's their laziness that he despises. For it is on account of this that they have the appearance of factory products and seem indifferent and unworthy of companionship or instruction. The human being, who does not wish to belong to the mass must merely cease being comfortable with himself. Let him follow his conscience, which shouts at him, "Be yourself." What you are at present doing, opining, and desiring, that's not really you. And why are you so firmly and triumphantly convinced that only the normal and the positive, in other words, only what is conducive to welfare, is for the advantage of man? Is not reason in error as regards advantage? Does not man perhaps love something besides well-being? Perhaps he is just as fond of suffering. Perhaps suffering is just as great a benefit to him as well-being. Man is sometimes extraordinarily, passionately in love with suffering, and that is a fact. There's no need to appeal to universal history to prove that. Ask yourself if you're a man and have lived it all. As far as my personal opinion is concerned, to care only for well-being seems to me positively ill-bred. Whether it's good or bad, it's sometimes very pleasant too to smash things. I hold no brief for suffering, nor for well-being either. I am standing for my caprice, and for its being guaranteed to me when necessary. Suffering would be out of place at amusement parks, for instance, I know that. In the Palace of Crystal, it is unthinkable. Now, in the late 1800s, there was a world exhibition in London, and they erected a palace of crystal at the World Exhibition, and it was the first building made out of glass and steel. And so it was a representation of the dawning materialist utopia, and that's the Palace of Crystal that Dostoevsky is referring to. In the Palace of Crystal, suffering is unthinkable. Suffering means doubt, negation, and what would be the good of a Palace of Crystal if there could be any doubt about it? And yet I think man will never renounce real suffering. That is destruction and chaos. Why? Suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. Though I did lay it down at the beginning that consciousness is the greatest misfortune for man, yet I know man prizes it and would not give it up for any satisfaction. We're now in a position to see the crucial significance of the existential psychotherapy movement. It is precisely the movement that protests against the tendency to identify psychotherapy with technical reason. We have seen that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, as well as the representatives of the existential cultural movement following them, we have seen that, yes, not only contributed far-reaching and penetrating psychological insights, which in themselves form a significant contribution to anyone seeking scientifically to understand modern psychological problems, but also did something else. They placed these insights on an ontological basis, namely the study of the individual as the being who has these particular problems. They believed that it was absolutely necessary that this be done, and that they feared that the subordination of reason to technical problems would ultimately mean the making of man over in the image of the machine. That's it. We'll see you on Thursday. You're going to have to stop doing that. Someone accused me of on YouTube of dubbing in applause at the end of my lecture.